What if I told you that most political pundits got election day wrong? So what happened? Why did the results turn out the way they did? And what can we learn moving forward? Joined by no one better to discuss these questions than Dr. Christopher Borick from Muhlenberg College, rated Pennsylvania's top political pollster, and he is going to break down the 2024 election results for us and all that's coming up right here, right now. I'm Sam Chen, and this is Face the Issues. Good evening and welcome to Face the Issues. As per usual, it seems that most political pundits across the country got the election wrong. So what happened? President-elect Donald Trump won not just the electoral vote, but the popular vote. Republicans swept across the country, won back the United States Senate, retained their majority in the House of Representatives, and in crucial swing states across the country, they swung Republican. So what happened? What did pundits get wrong? There's nobody better to discuss this than our dear friend, Dr. Christopher Borick from Muhlenberg College and Pennsylvania's top-rated pollster. Dr. Borick, welcome back to Face the Issues.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Sam. What a great time to be back to discuss another election cycle.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like we need to make this the endowed Christopher Borick chair and just engrave your name on the back of that seat.
I like it. It's a great chair in a good spot. So thank you for having me.
We deeply appreciate all the time you've given us this year and every election cycle. Let's start from the top. I mean, let's start with presidential. There's a lot to talk about. Senate, House, down the ballot. But presidential election, again, historic. The comeback, right? I mean, obviously the history of Grover Cleveland and now Donald Trump, this comeback, but just a crazy election year between the assassination, the withdrawal of President Biden. But just top level, I mean, he won the electoral vote. He won the popular vote. The 7 swing states that everybody kept looking at, he swept. From just post-mortem, what went right for them or what went wrong for Harris?
Yeah, no, those are great questions. And I like the framing, Sam, about right and wrong, right? And you're a good political scientist, and you know the importance of American political cycles and the challenges that are faced by a party in power when the seat's open, the president that's sitting in that seat is not very popular, and the public's not very happy. Those are political headwinds, right, or tailwinds, depending on which party you're looking at. And as you do, I teach classes. I teach an elections class this fall, and I started with my students, and I asked them, okay, we're going to try to predict the election outcomes, like lots of folks do. Before I even tell you about the candidates, is there anything that you would think would predict the outcome? And almost all the students, these are sophomores, juniors, seniors, said, well, how do the cycles go? And we start there. And I think that was lost on a lot of folks this year. I also think things that often get discounted in election cycles, like maybe in 2022 it was the Dobbs decision and its impact. In this cycle, the remnants of COVID, the remnants of the pandemic, the experiences with inflations that Americans had for the first time in generations are major factors that, when combined with a cycle that's hard for presidents' parties to defend, really did push in the direction. That doesn't guarantee anything. You know that as a political scientist. You still have to have a good campaign. Right. I think the Trump campaign was good. Former President Trump, President-elect Trump, is someone that certainly can go in his own direction. He's a unique force in American politics. We know that. But his campaign was crazy. Susie Wiles and the folks that did that were crazily disciplined with their ads, focusing on topics like inflation, like border security, eventually delving into culture wars that are at this moment, I think, advantageous to them. And they stayed on cue, and that everywhere across the country. The Harris campaign, again, headwinds that they were going into. People ask me all, and probably like you, was it a bad campaign? I don't think it was a particularly bad campaign. I think they ran, based on the candidate, based on the circumstances, a campaign that ultimately, in a place like Pennsylvania, even though they lost, if you look at some of their strategic moves, might have made it closer than it otherwise would have been.
Yeah, I want to ask, I want to get the policies later on, because obviously there's a lot to talk about, but I just want to ask about what you said, the cycle. And I love that you start with that some things just are cyclical and some things there's certain headwinds or tailwinds. I want to start with that, this conversation of Harris coming in so late. And I was in Washington election week, and a lot of Democratic pundits believe that if President Biden dropped out earlier, she would have won. Or one said that if he just announced he wasn't running, there's an open primary, that she would have won. I questioned whether she would have been the nominee at that point if there's an open primary. But one of the situations that we're seeing here is when President Biden selected her, she becomes the first female vice president, the first African-American vice president, the first Asian-American vice president. And she would be the first female president, first female African-American president, first Asian-American president, second African-American president. When he chooses to withdraw, she's got a very short window, but there's really no one else they can put up. There's that moment where they say, do we want a Gavin Newsom? But how do you take that moment of history away? Did the selection of Harris as VP back in 2020 handicap the moment now?
Oh, that's great, kind of framing it back all the way to that, right? Once she became the vice president, and I think in that cycle, she was a good pick for lots of reasons that you're trying to balance your ticket.
Right.
And we've always talked about how important vice presidents candidates are. Not all that much, but certainly it was good. But as you said, I think the President Biden, when he decided to step aside, was really mounting evidence that his campaign was untenable. Had very limited choices of what to do at that point. As you said, turning it open in the middle of summer to the type of really, quickly evolving debate that would have involved and been really kind of difficult, and producing a candidate through a convention process. While it would have been interesting for pundits like us, we would have had a field day.
As would late night.
Oh my gosh, the period. So I was, a little part of me was saying I'd love to see that once in my lifetime. But from a strategic perspective, I believe he was handicapped or handcuffed. That imagine him going away at that point from his vice presidential pick and saying, I'm going to endorse somebody else, or I'm going to open it up. And I think he basically made the choice that was in front of him. At that point, you deal with what's in front of you. You run the campaign you can. And I think she did. And again, I'm, as I review this with my students about the moves she made, could we always do our Monday morning quarterbacking? Of course we could. But on the whole, I think she ran a fairly solid campaign that was in a cycle and a historical pattern that was going to make it challenging for her.
Yeah. Did the flip-flopping hurt? I mean, we hear that, 2019, when she ran for the 2020 election, ran hard to the left. Let's ban fracking. Let's ban private insurance. Quick reversals. But President Trump did the same thing. I mean, he was very pro-life let's not have any federal regulations on abortion. The government should pay for IVF. Again, conservatives have not traditionally believed the government should pay for anything. How does the flip-flopping hurt one candidate but not the other?
Yeah, that's always a good question. How we evaluate affects things like our party loyalty, the asymmetry of how Democrats and Republicans respond to evidence and things like that. And that's the reality. And I always don't want to discount any gender effects. Sure. I think gender still matters, and race still matters in politics. Do they dictate outcomes, Sam? Not necessarily, but as part of the equation. So how she might be evaluated, let's acknowledge that could be part of it. The answer is, it does hurt, right? It does hurt. And this is a challenge for Democrats, where she got tagged on things like fracking and positions and policing, a whole bunch of areas that she kind of was more to the left on, because we have to move that way in primaries. Came back to bite her. And at a moment, again, thinking about my class a lot this week, we're reviewing kind of polling data where the electorate was going in the last few years. And since 2021, there has been a move on social issues in the United States in a more conservative direction, for example. Not gigantic. You know how often I use the word margin this year. I promise to put it away after this cycle. But what I said is there's been marginal moving across groups, demographics, to be a little more conservative on social issues in the wake of some of the movements of after the George Floyd murder. And that put her, I think, in a difficult position as kind of a defensive in that. Those ads that were brought back for her this cycle about something she said around the trans population. In this cycle, were challenging for her.
Interesting. The other thing I think to look at, you brought up too, the demographic stuff, where the former President Trump made strides in every demographic except for white men, which was surprising. And Harris lost ground to where Biden was in among the majority of these demographics. Right. Is there something that explains that? Obviously, these demographics are not monolithic. And I think pundits and strategists especially need to figure out Latinos do not all vote one way, Asians do not all vote one way, evangelicals do not all vote one way. But is there something that explains why she lost so much ground among so many demographics?
Yeah.
And President Trump did so much better?
Yeah, I'm not going to beat the cycle thing together. So when you see kind of widespread movement, really not at gigantic levels, a couple points here or there across demographics, to me it speaks to kind of broad atmospheric pressures. That it's, okay, the country's not feeling great. The country on a whole isn't like in the direction. The views on the economy. And those things all pressing at the same time tend to move people a little bit. And that's not immune to the groups you talked about based on race, ethnicity, age, a whole bunch of factors that we saw. It's kind of broadly felt when we look at polling right now about where the American electorate is. They're generally not all that happy. And so as you move kind of as a universal move. You said there's a couple of groups that maybe not so much, and there's some that are more. Often, and this is where we'll get into our little geeky math stat guy stuff, we talk about regression to the mean, right? When you're at one edge or extreme, it's more likely that the movements will be pretty big back towards the center, if you will. And for groups like voters of color that have traditionally been really Democratic, there's more room to move. You mentioned white men who have kind of moved dramatically to one side. Their ability to move all that much more gets hindered, and so you might not, you locate movement more in one place than other. But on a whole, this is an election where President Trump and Republicans largely made modest gains that were incredibly impactful in the end game.
Yeah, and that's all you need. I mean, we talked about margin how many times, right? That's all you need, modest gains in the margins to win a presidential election.
It's in all of that. You look at the election, like President Biden won here by about a point. In the end, when all votes are counted, I imagine President Trump's going to win in Pennsylvania by about 1.5 points. 4 years earlier, or 2016, he won by about half a point. You look at districts like where we live here in the 7th District in the Lehigh Valley. Susan Wild won by a point or so last time, lost by a point this time. Those are small margins.
All in the margins. So, Dr. Borick, I appreciate you breaking that down for us. When we come back, I want to talk about the issues and potentially how it affected the House and Senate as well.
Excellent.
So, don't go away. We'll be right back.
Face the Issues is produced and recorded in the studios of Lighthouse TV. Positively different. Watch Lighthouse TV wherever you go. Available on Roku, Amazon Fire TV, and Apple TV. You can view our in-house studio productions on demand, or watch what's on the station right now with our 24/7 live stream. Search Lighthouse TV online on your streaming device, or go to our website for more information. Visit lighthousetv.org to stay connected. There you can find out what's currently on the air and coming up. How to watch in your area on cable, satellite, broadcast, or streaming devices. Watch past programs or our live stream. Follow us on social media and learn more about the station, our hosts, and our programming. Lighthouse TV, positively different.
Welcome back to Face the Issues. Dr. Borick, thank you again for joining us. I want to talk about some of the issues that maybe dominated this election. 1992, James Carville. So he has actually said, I was listening to him on the Bulwark podcast with Tim Miller, the old Romney guy, and he made a correction. He said, I never said it's the economy, stupid. I said the economy, stupid. So apologies to James Carville. Apparently it's just the economy, stupid. But he came back to that point on this podcast, and he's been doing this on air this week, of this idea that all these other issues, fine, they are what they are, but came back to the economy. And I've argued it a step further. When you look at guys like Alan Lichtman, and they look at the 13 keys and the keys, he has 2 keys for the economy, but the perception of the economy matters more, right? I mean, numbers don't vote. And so, yes, growth per capita is important. Yes, unemployment numbers are important. Average family incomes are important. But at the end of the day, if somebody's getting a breakfast sandwich and a coffee at Wawa and paying $10, their perception, they don't care what the per capita growth is, their perception has changed. Did that drive this election? And when that happens, does that, I've always argued that it makes all the other issues secondary. Is that what we saw here?
Sam, I could probably end by just saying yes, and we don't have anything else to talk to. But absolutely yes, and it is that important. I mean, economic matters is what we see often the lens of our lives through, for good or bad. I mean, we're gonna have a great conversation about that, and does it push other things aside that should be an importance and ultimately will come back and affect our lives. And there's a lot of those things. But that's how voters often, their mood, right? Like I said before, the electorate's in a dour mood right now, and that's a big issue in America. There's not a lot of positive about direction. When we get into details about people's lives, they'll tell you good things, but on the whole, they don't feel that. And the economy is often related to that. Political science, again, we do research on marginal changes in things like gas prices in before elections, and we see they're impactful, right?
Right.
And this is on a broader scale. It's not just gas prices, like you said, it's the grocery stores, things that hit us in insurance costs. As I was talking to people this fall, they said, well, what's on your mind? Oh, I'm paying a ton more in insurance.
Oh, interesting.
Housing, of course, which is front and center. We live in a place like the Lehigh Valley where we've seen housing prices really hit. And this is before doing focus groups and polling well before the election, how important and problematic that was for people. And when that comes back on you, it is hard. And here's a problem for Democrats. They might make a case to someone like me who loves macroeconomic indicators and can make a case how it comparatively is, and I'll say, oh, that's actually totally right, and I'll do that. It's a hard case to make to voters that, hey, you're not feeling it, but it's there. I wouldn't want to be trying to make that case if I was a Democrat. And in fact, this is something they're going to have to understand. And of course, this time they're defending the economy.
Right.
By the way, that changes the day the president takes office. And we'll see, by the way, the polls change. This shows it. Of where we kind of have motivated reasoning right now. The same economy, largely that it is today, if it's in 2 months, Republicans will say it was great, that they were saying was terrible this fall, and vice versa. Nonetheless, the economic aspects defined so much of this race.
Yeah. Let me ask you about some of the things the Democrats ran on across the board, because they lost the Senate. And that was, again, what you talked about was just wins. I mean, they had more seats to defend, less seats that they could pick up. But we're talking historic losses. I mean, as we've taped this, there's a recount, but let's just say David McCormick is the senator-elect in Pennsylvania. Bernie Moreno in Ohio defeated longtime Senator Brown. The Senator Tester lost in Ohio. So this is a pretty significant shift. The Democrats put a lot of emphasis on democracy and January 6th. And there are a number of Republicans who are appalled by what happened on January 6th. There are a lot of Republicans that do not believe the last election was a stolen election. Did this argument not work? Is it just because the economy was so big, or did people think it was overblown? What happened? Where did the Democrats miss message?
Yeah, it's great, and that's maybe where a little bit of the surprise was. You look like the Casey race, right? I think Dave McCormick was a really formidable challenger this year, the best he's had.
Probably one of the best Republican statewide candidates we've had.
Absolutely.
Since maybe Pat Toomey left office.
I most certainly would agree. He fit I was calling him on a lot of my talks the Goldilocks candidate this year, because he doesn't offend the MAGA movement. He doesn't get tagged rhino, but he still has appeal, right? Based on his resume in business and West Point. So you're right to start, Sam. The map is always important, like I do with my class. Well, who's defending? And Democrats are defending in places like West Virginia, Ohio, and Montana, right? With incumbents or people stepping aside. You could pretty much, you don't have to be an analyst to say probably where those will end up. The Sherrod Brown's a good candidate and won a lot of times, so that was maybe a little bit surprising there of the three. But nonetheless, Republicans become really kind of red type state. And this is, you said, well, were they making a mistake on talking about January 6th and others? I think that resonates with more people than it doesn't, but it never had the saliency of other issues to voters like the economy. And I think, Sam, the electorate, especially in this mood that they're in right now, is pretty transactional in its natures. And that's transactional. It's like, look, I'm going to maybe think about immediate things that I can trade for in my where I'm going to go with my support right now to see if my life gets better, and I'll put aside some of those broader issues that aren't unimportant to me, but not necessarily what I'm thinking about. And that, to me, my best is that those issues didn't break through in a ways that they may have if the country was in a different kind of mindset.
Is this the idea, I mean, you said about transactions, is this the idea that when something affects, the more people it affects, the more likely it's a top issue? Like January 6th, everybody watched it, but it really affected the people who were there in the Capitol. I remember about 4 years ago talking to NPR about this issue, George Floyd versus COVID. It's not that George Floyd wasn't a tragedy and that everybody saw it, but COVID affected every single person in America, no matter where you lived, if you got the illness or not. And thus it was had more weight, I would argue. Is that this kind of thing with the economy, that everybody feels the economy, but not everybody feels January 6th, not everybody feels democracy or whatever?
It's a great way to frame it, Sam. Really, really well done. Yeah, and those examples that you give, a lot of things in our lives are maybe limited to our region, our demographic, our profession. Some things are pretty universal, right? That we feel, and that those, of course, if you combine something that's fairly universal and it's also salient at that moment because people don't feel good about it, it's a pretty big weight to carry if you're trying to go against it, or a nice force pushing you along in this election. And those things can't be understated in terms of, like, you could run campaigns, right? Good campaigns into headwinds. And we've seen that happen, and people pull out wins. And you can see people screw up when they have the wins at their back. I'll give you a ton of more examples of that to do. It doesn't guarantee you anything. But those kind of big pressures this year really were a challenge for Democrats.
Yeah. The other thing we saw is the issues is the Israel-Gaza situation, and this is where I will eat crow on this one. We had that forum a year ago, and you argued that it was going to move the needle, and I argued, where are you going to go? If that's your issue, where are you going to go? But you're correct. I mean, parts of Michigan, where Jill Stein got second, Dearborn, Michigan, right? She gets second, polling, 30% of the final vote. And then in Pennsylvania, Muslim activists have told me that they bucked the third party and actually went full throttle Republican. Did that swing the vote? I mean, is that enough to say that cost her these 7 swing states? What kind of impact did it have?
Yeah, it certainly cost her votes. Looking at the data, and everything's incomplete, but if you match up demography and where voters are based on their race and ethnicity, and how performances was, that you kind of alluded to this, Sam, there's pretty clear evidence, even at this point, that it did cost her. I don't think it was, at the end, the factor that cost her the election.
Sure.
That if you added those votes, would it have changed it in any of the swing states? Probably not. Michigan might, or you could kind of push it and play with it. But it was the Democrats, with the challenges that they had, you add in other challenges. And this is a significant, obviously impactful issue on every matter that we could talk about, but also from a political perspective, it was another fraying of their coalition. This was a year that, when you look at the Democratic coalition, there's lots of fraying at the edges among voters of color. Sure. Black men, Latinos, looking at certain demographics that we look at. Both, by the way, this played out, and we'll see, among voters of Middle Eastern origin, Jewish voters maybe to some degree, that we'll see as we kind of piece through this. All fraying, sometimes fraying a lot, like you mentioned in Dearborn and other places, and others just enough that it combines for the outcome that we got, marginal victories. Someone I was talking to today said it looks like a sea of red, when you flip the map from last time in the 7 swing states, and it kind of has that. I go, absolutely, it covers a lot of ground. How deep is that sea?
Right.
Is what I would look at, and how we read this election. You could say, well, this is a mandate, this is a sweeping election, and undoubtedly, you'd look at the Electoral College, you look at those states. How far did it move from where we were a few years ago? A lot of Democrats didn't show up, a whole bunch of things that we could look at, but the margins at the end of the day were pretty close again. And so how do you read an election like that?
Last question before we go to the break. Was this doomed from the start, or is there something the Harris campaign could have done to win? Yeah,
I lean to that she could not have done anything. It's a close election, and you might say, wow, could they have done something differently to do? Could they have changed, worked more aggressively with the Arab American community, changed their rhetoric on certain things, tried different things like get out the vote. I'll say one last thing about this. A good campaign could lose. A message that we might take away from this election, Sam, they say, well, look, they did all that canvassing and it didn't mean anything in Pennsylvania. I'll say the opposite. I think it kept it closer than it otherwise would have been. You look at states like New Jersey and New York where there wasn't campaigning and the drop-offs in this cycle were big. My contention is that if you walk away from this lesson saying we don't have to do that stuff, you might take the wrong lesson away.
Oh, that's great advice.
Yeah.
That's great. Don't go away. We'll be right back.
Face the Issues is produced and recorded in the studios of Lighthouse TV. Positively different.
Welcome back to Face the Issues. Dr. Borick, thank you again for joining us today, but also this whole year. A wacky election cycle, and I just appreciate you've been with us every step of the way. I know your time is precious, so we really appreciate it.
That's my pleasure, Sam.
Thank you. I want to close. I know last time you were here, we talked about the comparisons between this year and 1968. We joked about Robert Kennedy being involved, the convention in Chicago, assassination attempts, all that stuff. But in the private conversation, you've talked about extensively with me about how 68 closed out. I know that's the first presidential election you were alive for, and certainly probably not one that you were fully engaged in. You're not that old. You're young. So, but when you walk away from 2024, I think a lot of people walk away from it disappointed, with despair. Even people who potentially voted Republican, who maybe look at some of the cabinet picks and just think, is this where we are, or are these choices the best we have? Can you talk to us about how 68 rounded out and what potential hope we might have going into 2025?
Yeah, it's so great. And I do love those comparisons. And they're not always perfect, but they give us a sense of this time not necessarily being unique in every facet, right? It has its own unique features. And so if you remember in 1968, after this turbulent year, assassination of RFK, Martin Luther King, a very tumultuous campaign, President Johnson stepping aside. The year ended in one of the most classic, iconic moments in American history. This was Apollo 8. Early in the Apollo missions, the first time that we orbited the moon. And that's where the iconic image of the Earthscape comes up, the rising Earth over the moon, which signified to lots of folks the unity of a people, right, on the planet. And the astronauts on that did the famous reading from Genesis, right? They picked that reading out to end the year. And this is happening at the late December of that year, and really did give this moment of reflection for the country in a turbulent, divided nation of something bigger, right? And so you hope, I don't know, we don't have any missions moving up in this year, but anything that the country can kind of look to and say, all right, we're still the United States of America and a world united by our humanity.
A humble picture to remember that maybe we're not as important as
always a good thing
to
remind ourselves. Yeah.
Dr. Borick, thank you again for joining us. Thank you for all that you do.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much, Sam, and all the crew here. It's wonderful.
It's our pleasure. My thanks again to Dr. Chris Borick for joining us, for breaking down the 2024 election, and thanks to each of you for tuning in. Hope to see you again right back here next week. Until then, my name is Sam Chen. On behalf of all of us here at Face the Issues, thank you and good night.